Firstly, I want to thank all of you who are here this evening for being here. Many of us in the last 2 years haven't been attending meetings. I've been speaking endlessly on Zoom events. Of course, the person who does that par excellence is Maurice Cohen, who's been practically running his own personal television station for the last 2 years. What's sort of disappointing is that RTE haven't yet offered Maurice a very large contract for a nightly show, and really it's time they did. I think it was great that the ambassador had an opportunity to engage in the way she did here this evening. Some of you for the first time would have seen her, some of you would have heard her perhaps on one of Maurice's Zooms. Hopefully, as we further work our way through the COVID pandemic, there'll be more opportunities for this type of engagement. Natasha, I don't know what I can say about Natasha other than she's an absolute star. She's the only one of us who had to fly over this evening from foreign parts to be here. So could I ask you to give Natasha a very special round of applause? I'm here wearing a number of hats. I don't know, can I balance them all adequately? My first hat, as Jackie mentioned, is that I'm chairperson of Magen David Adom Ireland. Magen David Adom in Israel, as some of you are familiar with, is the Israel Emergency Health and Medical Service. It's an unusual body in that in most countries the emergency service is run by the state. Magen David Adom started off as a voluntary charitable agency back in the 1930s, and when Israel became independent it could have been incorporated into government, but decided it would be more flexible and deliver a more beneficial emergency health service if it didn't. So it continues to be an independent medical emergency service. It's Israel's national service, and it does receive some money from government for services it provides. But it also substantially relies on international contributions. And Magen David Adom Ireland is the voluntary group here who raise funds for Magen David Adom in Israel. And I see some people here this evening who I know have generously contributed to Magen David Adom over the past 2 years since we came into existence. And I want to use this opportunity to personally thank all of those who've done so. And I want to tell you that in the context of positive engagement, at this stage over 40,000 euros has been raised in Ireland for Magen David Adom and has gone to Israel. 5 defibrillator stations have been acquired. Another very expensive medical device of a complicated nature has been purchased with those monies, and over 10,000 euros went towards making up additional expenditure that was incurred during the Israel-Hamas conflict back in May last. And I know that people in Israel running Magen David Adom are very grateful for all the contributions made. And I think it's important I mention Magen David Adom this evening in the context of the challenges Israel faces, and indeed the dilemmas of dealing with the Irish perspective of Israel as it's contaminating Leinster House, as it's portrayed by people in government, and as it's presented by the anti-Israel NGOs that exist, and the anti-Israel campaigning groups. And the reason is because Magen David Adom is the most integrated organisation in the entirety of Israel. Those who wrongly accuse Israel of being an apartheid state choose to ignore that the National Medical Service, which employs 2,500 professionals and over 22,000 volunteers, all who've been trained to deal with emergency medical care, come from every community, every religion, every section of Israeli society. Whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Druze, any possible denomination, whether you're Arab, Jewish, black, white, brown, makes no difference. Gay, straight, no one in Magen David Adom cares. Magen David Adom provides a service to everyone in Israel. if there's a medical emergency, they provide the service. Magen David Adom has administered over 1 million COVID vaccines during the COVID crisis. It's been involved in administering the booster vaccines. It's carried out over 1 million COVID tests. It's provided COVID vaccinations for over 120,000 Palestinians. And the very existence and working and structure of Magen David Adom gives the lie to the false accusation that Israel is an apartheid state. Now, Morris, when he was interviewing the ambassador, made reference to some of the organizations that exist in this country that present themselves as pro-Palestinian. Now, let me say where I'm coming from before I get into this. I absolutely believe that if this conflict is ever to be resolved, a two-state solution is required. I also absolutely believe that it's currently impossible to bring about a two-state solution, and that's through no fault of Israel. It's impossible because one of the issues that government in Ireland ignores, politicians ignore, these campaigning groups ignore, is that for over 14 years there have been two separate Palestinian entities. One in Gaza, one in the West Bank. One is run by Hamas, the other is run by Fatah. Fatah and Hamas do not talk constructively to each other than in Egypt, where every so often there are meetings in Cairo to work out their differences, which are never worked out. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, elected as president in 1995, with no election since, dare not set foot in Gaza for fear of assassination. There have been no elections since 1996. The presidential was 95, the other elections were 96. Israel is a vibrant, argumentative, difficult democracy. What you have in Gaza and the West Bank are two totalitarian regimes with no democratic accountability, violating the rule of law and regularly jailing their political opponents and torturing them. In the last year, an individual in Gaza who wanted to work for peace and dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians and had the liberty of engaging with some campaigning Israelis who want to see a two-state solution, engaging with them on Zoom, found himself jailed by Hamas for talking to the enemy. Now, we learned in our peace process a number of things. And here is the dilemma for Israel in Ireland and the difficulty. We learned there's no magic solutions to conflicts. There's no instant solutions. In circumstances where conflicts have existed for so many years, you need to build bridges. You need to develop trust. You need to encourage dialogue. You need to encourage people to work together, engage together, respect and understand each other's different historical perspectives, and work to bring about accommodations that facilitate people living in peace and in security. All very basic. What's the approach of the organisations in Ireland? Morris was absolutely right when he said to the ambassador that these organisations are more anti-Israeli than pro-Palestinians. Not only are they anti-Israeli, they encourage a continuing destructive narrative from the Palestinian side that's damaging to Palestinians. I'm saying this as someone who over the years had met with and talked with Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, and each of the different Palestinian negotiators, the late Sarah Barakat and Abu Ala. Abu Ala was one of the people directly involved in bringing about the Oslo Accords. And I've met them officially, I've met them unofficially, and discussed the conflict. When it comes to Arafat and Abbas, they will frequently say one thing to an international audience and the opposite to the domestic audience. What the Irish NGOs do is encourage an escalation of conflict, oppose dialogue, oppose economic and business cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians by promoting that Israel be boycotted, and have no objective other than the destruction of the Israeli state. And that is the narrative also of Sinn Féin. One of the biggest tragedies in Irish politics is the fact that Sinn Féin back in the 1980s and 1970s were assisted and trained by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and have been addicted to a negative anti-Israeli narrative ever since, which has now been inherited by the younger members of Sinn Féin represented in Dáil Éireann who were not involved in violence in their days. And they now run a narrative which is contaminating Irish politics and which is totally exposed in the report that Natasha mentioned that was recently published on anti-Semitism in Ireland, David Collier's report. And the problem is that the anti-Israeli narrative, the false allegation that Israel is an apartheid state, the false allegation that Israel is engaged in ethnic cleansing at a time when the Palestinian population is multiplying at an enormous rate. And why not? I'm not critical of it. But ethnic cleansing is about population reduction, not populations increasing. The negative narrative that they run has strayed so far into using anti-Semitic tropes as to now contaminate not just our political system, but Irish society. There is a real and growing problem now within our universities, where Jewish students are targeted, within politics, where there isn't a single person, either in government or outside it, willing to stand up against this narrative. And it's contaminating the public's perspective and Irish journalism. And it's an enormous problem. And it's a dilemma that we have to confront. It's a dilemma with which the ambassador is presented. Now, I have, and I'm going to conclude on this, a memory going back many years. As a young 25-year-old lawyer, I was in the National Archive conducting research for the very first family law book that I published. And I was conducting research on the background to the 1937 Constitution and what submissions President David de Valera received, which resulted in the framing of that constitution in a particular way. And by accident, I came across a file sitting beside the files I was looking at from the Department of Justice. It was a file from 1935-36, and I had a look at it, and then I spent 2 days buried in it. The file was full of letters, some in German, some in good English, some in broken English, from German Jews trying to escape from Nazi Germany before the Holocaust. And the file had within it the advice of Charles Bewley, the then Irish anti-Semitic ambassador in Berlin, who told who told the Department of Justice that all applications by Jews to come to Ireland should be refused because Jews will contaminate Ireland's culture and damage Irish people. And that advice was taken by the Department of Justice, who consistently denied visas to German Jews coming to Ireland, many of who wished to come to Ireland, many of whom no doubt perished in the Holocaust. 1994, when John Bruton was Taoiseach, he apologised for the failure of the Irish government at that time, and also for the refusal of the Irish government to accept the survivors of the concentration camps into Ireland. Now, when Minister Coveney talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, he consistently criticises Israel and holds Israel as solely responsible for the fact that the conflict has not yet been resolved. He says nothing about the divisions between Fatah and Hamas. He says nothing about what is called the pay-for-slay policy, where Fatah pays, or the Palestinian Authority pays, pensions to the terrorists convicted of murdering Israelis, men, women and children, and the more you murder, the higher pension you will get. There is nothing said about the lack of elections within the Palestinian territories. There is nothing said about the manner in which the Palestinians are treating their own people, and nothing at all said by the level of intolerance shown to the gay community by both Fatah and Hamas. Hamas more violently than Fatah, who are prepared to throw gay people off the top of buildings. According to Coveney, it is all Israel's fault. And what I find quite extraordinary is that a minister in government from a party of which I used to be a member has the chutzpah to tell Israelis where they're entitled to live. A country that denied access to Jewish people seeking to come here to escape from Germany in 1930, that denied a home to the survivors of the Holocaust, seems to think it is entitled to tell Jewish people where they can and cannot live. I want to see Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace. Visiting the West Bank, I have seen Israelis and Palestinians working side by side in industrial parks. In some of the businesses, Palestinians in charge telling Israelis what they should do. We need more of that. But what I have learned in a long life in politics, internationally and domestically, is often those who make accusations are covering up their own conduct. And I'm going to conclude quite simply on this. Israel is not an apartheid state as it's contended. Where apartheid is being exercised, sadly and tragically, is in Gaza, where it was unacceptable for any Israeli or Jew to remain. They departed in 1995. And where apartheid is being advocated, it's being advocated by the narrative that no Israeli or Jewish person should be permitted to live on the West Bank, and that settlements of themselves are an obstruction to peace and the conflict ending, particularly in circumstances where the settlements are providing employment for Palestinians. For many Palestinians, this is not nonsensical. But what's particularly unfortunate is the Irish government have adopted the narrative that the only reason the conflict, and the sole reason, apparently, the conflict in their eyes is continuing, is because some Israelis live on the West Bank. And if it's Irish government policy that no Jewish person should live on the West Bank, it's the Irish government that's advocating apartheid in the Middle East. It's not Israel. And the groups who are advocating apartheid in Ireland are the campaigning groups who regularly pillory and demonise and delegitimise the Israeli state. Now, I've talked longer than I intended, and I want to conclude by welcoming and introducing you to Audrey Griffin. Audrey has written this fantastic book, Hey Ireland, Israel's on the Line. Audrey is a great speaker, a wonderful singer, if I may say, and her book is very different in presenting Israel's case to the Irish people. Audrey comes to it from both a religious and a secular perspective in addressing the different issues that arise. It's a book that should be compulsory reading. for every member of Leinster House, and indeed for every member of government. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Audrey Griffin.